Welcome to another Ocean Ideas Talk, brought to you by Ocean Lovers.
We have Hannah Tait, we have Laura Simmons, and we have Associate Professor Rachael Gray, three of the best people in the business. So much is impacting our much-loved megafauna and marine creatures, things like seals and dolphins and turtles. And so this is your chance, our chance collectively, to be enlightened by the positive actions underway to help preserve both their environments and their numbers. By way of introduction, Hannah Tait is the CEO of Action for Dolphins, a marine conservation organization dedicated to protecting dolphins and their ocean home. Hannah's been working with Action for Dolphins since 2017, doing things like spearheading campaigns, fostering community and donor relations, and engaging in public affairs. Laura Simmons, in the middle. Laura is the Australia-New Zealand Regional Curator for SEALIFE Wildlife Attractions. She's been working with aquariums and aquatics-related projects around the world for over 33 years, and you may have heard Laura speaking earlier this afternoon. And last but not least, on the far side from me, we have Dr. Rachael Gray, Associate Professor Rachael Gray, who has led over 40 field trips to remote islands in South Australia and Victoria, applying her training as a veterinarian to health and disease investigations. Please, would you join me in welcoming our panel? We might start over on the far side with you, Rachael, jumping to attention. Tell us a bit about your work. I was fortunate enough to hear you on Thursday talking about your work with seal pups, but tell us a bit about your work and what's been keeping you occupied the last couple of years.
No worries, thanks Robin. So my work is largely with pinnipeds, so our finned feet friends, so seals and sea lions. And I'm a veterinarian by training, and largely I do health and disease and toxicant investigations. And at the moment my focus is on Australian sea lions, which are Australia's only endangered pinniped species. And we've worked out that Australian sea lions are significantly affected by an intestinal worm called hookworm, and we actually have been using a really readily available topical application of a very common drug which Trump made famous, ivermectin, which is a very common drug used in animal husbandry, and we apply that topically to Australian sea lion pups, and we can improve their health, welfare and mortality outcomes just by that simple intervention.
We were trying to get through today without saying the word Trump. You've blown that
Apologies.
Completely. That's all right. Is the hookworm, is that getting worse in populations, or are there other factors which are causing the population decline?
So I think sea lions and hookworms and sea lions globally and seals globally have all co-evolved with this parasite. But what I think is happening that it's making it more of a problem for our sea lion populations and fur seal populations is there's a multitude of other effects now and impacts that are basically making it harder for the sea lions, and I'll talk particularly about Australian sea lions, to cope with the infection. So things like toxicants, so those forever chemicals or PFAS, which actually alter the immune response. If you have an animal that has endemic disease like hookworm and then you suppress their immune response, it makes it much more difficult for them to deal with that infection. Things like prey depletion, possibly poor nutritional status of the mums could also impact how these animals are able to handle an endemic infection. So I think hookworm's been there the whole time. We only really discovered it as a problem in the last sort of 15 years. But I think the real reason it's becoming more of a problem is all those other multifactorial impacts that impact all marine species.
Thank you. We can come back to that later because, again, I've got a zillion questions. Laura, thank you for your answer about in situ breeding for grey nurse shark populations. And I don't know, hopefully some of the audience were able to hear you talk about the handfish populations and the STAR project. But tell us a bit about your work around, different conservation projects and insurance populations and what you do.
Thank you. Yes, we're actually with SEALIFE globally. We're working on a lot of different programs, but here in Australia and New Zealand, because we are working with Australia's native fauna, we are specifically focused on those endangered and threatened species. Unfortunately, the ones that are most in peril are the ones that are coastal dwellers. So they are species like white seahorses or the Hippocampus whitei. We've been working to recover them for over 5 years, collaborating with lots and lots of other government officials, universities, to try to find a way to recover their populations. that are in decline specifically because their habitat is in decline. So anthropogenic impacts, basically people and our existence, is causing a threat to these animals. So we're trying to find a way to not only recover the species but also their habitats. One project that is quite interesting is another species you may have never heard of, and that's the Maugean skate. That's a recovery team that I've only just been working on. A task force was formed in July of last year to recover this species. It's truly the most endangered species of elasmobranch, which are the sharks, rays, guitarfish, sawfish, in the world. And that particular species has been studied for over 15 years and in decline for over 15 years, but we have not had them ex situ in order to be able to work with them and kind of crack the code on how to care for them. If you were in my presentation earlier, what I was trying to describe was how can we know how to care for an animal in the wild if we don't know how to care for them in general? And I think that's the key for ex situ husbandry and the work that aquariums do, is that if we can nut that out, we can have an insurance population. So right now there's an insurance population of the Maugean skate, which are only found in one location in the entire world. They're endemic, just like our Australian sea lions. So not just endemic, but critically endangered. And there are very few of them left in the world. They live in Macquarie Harbour, down in a beautiful Strahan, Tasmania, on the west coast of Tasmania. And the species would go relatively unnoticed if you didn't hear about them from us and the researchers. So now we have some of those animals ex situ, where we're learning how to care for them, and we have insurance populations. So hopefully if there's a massive collapse or decline in the wild environment, we will have the genetics and the species and the know-how to be able to reintroduce them into the wild someday. So there's a laundry list, though, honestly, Robin. There are so many species I'd love to share. So just know that we're trying. We're doing our best.
It is really good to hear some of the positive stories, whether it's treatment of hookworm in seal pups, sea lion pups, whether it's the progress in husbandry and population restoration. Hannah, tell us what's going on with Action for Dolphins. Please make it good news.
Yeah, well, I'll start with what we actually work on. So it's in our name. We act to prevent dolphin suffering. And we work to end dolphin hunting over in Japan, as well as the wild capture of dolphins for the marine park trade. We also work to remove deadly shark nets here in New South Wales and in Queensland and end dolphin captivity worldwide. We have some smaller campaigns to end the regulated and unregulated feeding of wild dolphins, and also to get stronger nature laws here in Australia.
You said something there that I'd love to hear a bit more about. You talked about ending dolphin hunting in Japan. How do you go about that? That's a massive geopolitical issue, but how do you do that, and how can people get involved?
Yeah, so for starters, we work with a campaigner in Japan and with local groups in Japan on that campaign. We tackle it from a legal perspective. So we've tried a number of different angles through the legal systems in Japan. The most recent one was through the criminal system, or the criminal law, because the mercury levels in dolphin meat is really high because of the pollution through the ocean and up the food chain. So we tested a dolphin meat sample that had levels 97.5 times higher than the regulated amount, safe consumption amount for seafood in Japan. And we used this to launch a criminal complaint against the supplier of dolphin meat that sold that via Yahoo Japan. And some good news that Taiji dolphin meat supplier actually shut down off the back of that action. And in the latest hunts, we saw a reduction of almost 50% of dolphins that were killed. So we are getting somewhere with dolphin hunting in Japan, and that's our efforts and also just a global collective effort. There's a lot of, I'm sure some people here have heard of it from the documentary The Cove. There's a lot of international attention on what goes on in Japan, and so to keep that up and to keep raising awareness about it is really important. And yeah, come and check us out on our website, afd.org.au, to see other ways to get involved, like signing the petition, donating, etc., to our actions.
Sorry, what was the website again?
afd.org.au.
Good. I would love to hear, before we go to questions, I'd love to hear a little more about, I guess, next steps. So you've talked about treatment of the sea lion pups and how ivermectin can help, especially if it's reapplied, and you've been doing these trials. What's the next step? So where do you take this? How do you scale this up?
That's actually a really tricky question, just because philosophically we have this idea that, these animals have this endemic disease, so it's naturally in their populations, and then we say, okay, we've got a really easy treatment we can apply, but we really need to think about, should we apply it? Is it an intervention that is appropriate for the population? And I think in terms of ivermectin intervention for Australian sea lions, it could be really targeted and quite focal on maybe the larger populations, the ones that are in decline, which is usually the larger ones, applying it to the really vulnerable animals that we know of. And we know that pretty much pups less than 2 weeks of age, and unfortunately female pups, are the most vulnerable to mortality by hookworm and other causes of mortality. So what we can actually do is, based on the research that we have and the outcomes that we have, we can apply a really nuanced approach to conservation and to application of a medication, because logistically, going to every Australian sea lion colony, and there's about 86 around the coast, is not logistically feasible. So we may need to be really targeted in how we actually approach intervention, and importantly, we need to monitor the effectiveness of that intervention as we go. It's not just a case of going and treating everything and then saying, great, we've done it. We need to monitor that it's still effective and that it's still doing what we're hoping it's doing.
I'm so sorry to wait until you're on the stage with the microphone before asking you this question, but how do you make that sort of ethical decision about intervention? When is it right? When is it not right? How do you go about that?
It's actually something I've struggled with for a long time. We've actually been treating pups in various research trials since 2011, quite small scale, and then we're currently at Seal Bay right now, Kangaroo Island. We are treating 50% of the population with ivermectin of the pups born, 50% are not being treated. So at this point in time, it's still a research process. So as a researcher, I feel I can deal with that situation, that we're using research outcomes to basically provide evidence base for conservation. We really need to have some conversations or ongoing conversations with managers of these populations in South Australia and Western Australia, and actually we do have a really good relationship. And part of the reason I'm at Seal Bay this year is because we want to make sure we can replicate the great outcomes we had in the last summer high mortality season with another summer season, because we know that we can improve mortality, growth, welfare outcomes in summer mortality seasons more so than the winter ones.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Laura, not as difficult. I guess, what are the next steps? Again, you've been talking about some of these amazing projects, and I'm not going to attempt the STAR acronym in full, but what are the next steps for these? How do you, again, scale them up? How do you make those decisions about where to try and repopulate, where intervention is necessary?
That it is a multifold approach. It really is. It is a hard question, actually, because there takes so many people, there takes so much information. It's all required to be able to accomplish everything. The little things that we do, or what we consider quite big in a public aquarium, being able to care for these animals and even breed them, learn how to rear the offspring, to get them ready for a release program, that's great. But we also have to know that their habitats are being restored. So habitat restoration and protection of those areas. Basically, we won't release animals if they're going to be put into a welfare state that's worse than in the aquarium. So it's very important that we know that they're safe and protected. We have a little species called the southern pygmy perch that we're working on in SEALIFE Sydney. It's a species that's really never bred in captivity, and we don't have the numbers to be producing and releasing them into the wild. But what's happening while we're trying to crack that code and breed this species, we are working with fisheries managers all throughout New South Wales and Victoria. It's actually, an alliance that we have for small-bodied natives, which I love that name. It's basically all the little teeny tiny freshwater fishes that some people might forget, but are quite important to the ocean as well, because they're part of the apex predators are up here. These are the little guys that provide everything to everybody, including mosquito eradication. So with a species like that, whilst we're working on their husbandry and reproduction, the fisheries managers and land managers and waterway managers, they're trying to establish areas where, if we're able to breed them, where would they be released? Because their biggest threats are that their waterways are disappearing, they're drying up, as well as invasive species. So we've got to eradicate the invasive species, and we need to be able to put them back where their seagrasses or all the grasses are growing. So steps like that are what will be happening. And then also us making sure that we're dedicated in the long haul. We have the SEALIFE Trust, which is the way we're able to bring in funding through our facilities, where people can say, I want to save a species, so donate to that. And with all of the revenue that we have, we're able to use that to continue these in perpetuity. So for example, if you want to hear some numbers, for the White's Seahorse program, we have been running that program for 5 years now at SeaLife Sydney Aquarium, and it's roughly $400,000 a year to raise the babies that we're raising. So we're trying to be able to, and that includes all of the care, the housing, the staffing. It's a big chunk of money, and we're not getting government grants for this. This is what we are purposely working on because we believe in it, and we're committed to it in perpetuity. So basically our job is to find a way to keep it going, because 1 year, one event isn't enough to recover them.
Thank you.
Sure.
And Hannah, I guess, I'd love to hear what progress looks like. Where do you want action for dolphins to be in 5-10 years' time? What does that scale and that progress look like for you?
Yeah, I think at the moment we're focusing on, as I said, dolphin hunting and dolphin captivity, but we're also working on what are the real big ticket items that are affecting dolphins, and the same three keep coming up. It's climate change, it's overfishing, and it's pollution. So what role can we play as an organisation in fighting and making an impact on those big ticket items? I will make a call out that our federal government is currently redrafting the Environmental Biodiversity and Conservation Act, and this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for people like yourselves to talk to your MPs, to sign petitions, and to make it really clear that you want really strong nature laws that will actually properly protect the environment, the ocean in particular for this audience, and not have loopholes for big businesses, etc. So that's something that's happening right now. There's actually a community survey running until the end of March, and it's an opportunity because the government genuinely cares about the opinions of people in this room when it comes to this issue. So please do. I really want to motivate people to do that, and that type of lobbying work is something we'll always be working on as well, and letting people know what's going on.
And can people find that online, or is that linked from your website?
Yeah, there's a lot of different groups working on it. If you Google Strong Nature Laws, Action for Dolphins, it should come up. And there's also the Places You Love Alliance, which is an alliance of lots of different conservation groups working on the redrafting of the EPBC Act.
Thank you. I think it's time that we came to the audience for questions. I would love to hear if you have anything to ask. Hand went straight up there, so we'll come over there first. But please do get your questions ready.
Do dolphins in Australia have a high mercury reading as well?
We haven't tested any dolphin meat in Australia because we can't access it the same way. So it's sold for human consumption online in Japan, so we were able to purchase it and test it for mercury. But yes, assuming so, because they're migratory species, so they're the same dolphins that could be coming past Australia that are migrating past Japan.
Hi, thank you all for the talk. Question for Hannah as well. When it comes to targeting, you mentioned preventing marine parks and the capturing. Where do you target the supply chain there? Is it at the marine parks themselves, or is it with the actual groups going out to capture the dolphins, or is it both?
Both, yeah. So we focus on Taiji in Japan, where they capture wild dolphins. From Taiji, they mainly go to China, to Thailand, to some parts of the Middle East, and within Japan itself. We're focusing because we already have networks within Japan to slow down the trade capture from Taiji to aquariums in Japan, which we recently had, or it was a number of years ago now in 2015, some huge success with a legal action against the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums, which some of the aquariums in Japan were a part of, yet buying from the Taiji hunts. And we use the cruelty angle, so the way that dolphins are killed during the hunts is really brutal, and the fact that the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums was essentially condoning it by having Japanese aquariums as part of their association, which meant that those aquariums cut ties with the hunts and 62 stopped buying from the hunts. So we sort of look at it from a macro angle, okay, where are these aquariums, who are they associated with, how can we stop this at a big level? And then we also lobby individual marine parks to see if they'll cut ties with the hunts, again, based on that cruelty angle. And we're also launching a campaign in Thailand, and that will be focused both from the marine park level, but often marine parks don't want to have the conversation with us, so we'll also lobby within government to see if we can stop wild imports of dolphins.
Two questions, one's for Rachel and one's for Hannah. Rachel, this is more of a personal interest question. You mentioned that the female sea lion pups were at high mortality rates than the males. Just out of curiosity, do you know why that is?
Yeah, so I think, so basically they were the most vulnerable to hookworm infection and mortality overall. It's probably because they are born smaller than the male pups. There does seem to be a bit of a trend too in that the male pups are born sort of more earlier in the season, and then we start to set the girls later on. So whether that's related to maternal investment, maternal nutrition, but the reality is the sexual dimorphism that these species have starts at birth. So the girls are smaller, and so they're probably more vulnerable to that to aggression from other animals, and more vulnerable to, you know, if they lose weight, it's probably more significant to them than it could be for the males. But they both have really high mortality anyway.
Thank you. And the other question was for Hannah. Just backing onto the other person's question about mercury levels in dolphins in Australia. Obviously, we don't have dolphin meat here, but with dolphins that are caught, unfortunately, in shark nets, for instance, and people are doing necropsies on them, are you able to get results from those pathologists doing necropsies and getting mercury readings from those dolphins?
It's a really good question. At the moment, they're not being tested. The dolphin meat's not being tested for mercury, as far as I know, for dolphins that are caught in shark nets. We're more focused on getting shark nets removed than what we can get out of the dolphins that are caught. Yeah, that's our real focus with shark nets. But it's a good question. I'd never thought of that before.
Yeah, great.
Any final questions before we wrap things up for the last panel session of the day? I think I'd love to hear, if we can end on a positive note, given this afternoon's conversations, any sort of any next steps or positive stories of either about species or about your next steps as a scientist, as an activist, that you'd like to share?
I'd probably say that the great thing is the recovery plan for the Australian sea lion is being written at the moment. It's going to be really fantastic because the recovery plan's a little bit overdue right now, so it's going to be fantastic to have a new recovery plan that's been developed in a really collaborative way with researchers, government, NGOs, Indigenous contributions as well. So that's a real positive. And I really hope that by the end of July I'll be able to put out some information about some really positive outcomes from the current ivermectin trial that we're running at Seal Bay, because we are seeing improved health. We're seeing really big fat pups out there that have been treated, and we're also seeing treated pups that aren't actually dying from whatever cause of trauma. So that's a good positive for us.
Well done. We're looking forward to July and positive announcements. Laura.
Yeah, I think, gosh, I just want to end on a message of hope that I do think just having you here, being involved, being interested, learning, and then collaborating with one another, that's the way that we'll actually be able to make a major impact. It's the questions and the connections that are made to solve problems. And yeah, it's not too late. We really do. There is a lot of hope out there, and there is a lot of great work being done. Just being involved is half the battle. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. And Hannah.
I think I'll tell the story of the breeding ban that we achieved for dolphins in captivity in New South Wales, where there was a legislative change only a few years ago that went through the Parliament. So we worked with the marine park up in Coffs Harbour to move their dolphins to a sanctuary environment. And behind the scenes, as part of that project, we were lobbying them pretty hard that a big sticking point with this is that you're still breeding, that you still have an active breeding program. Eventually, the park manager actually ended up saying in the media that the writing was on the wall for this type of entertainment venue, and that they will be no longer breeding dolphins. And then a few years later, there was a parliamentary inquiry into the exhibiting of cetaceans. And again, that same manager said they don't have an issue with a ban because they're not breeding anyway. And I spoke at that inquiry and gave evidence about high infant mortality rates for cetaceans in captivity and a few other things. And then happy to say that the law was changed, and so you can no longer breed dolphins in this state any longer.
Thank you for ending on a note of positivity there. Please would you join me in thanking the amazing Rachael, Laura and Hannah.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Ocean Ideas. Please make sure to share it with your networks and help us in our mission to turn ripples of action into waves of change for our blue planet.